I'm Fran Jemmott, and I'm a life member of NCNW. I first heard of the National Council of Negro Women when I was in high school, and since I'm 77 years old, you can do the math and figure out how long ago that might have been. And then I you know, did a lot of things, never realizing that I would end up where I am now, which is opening a small home-based business. And we are management consultants. And our clients are typically foundations and government, people who give money. And, you know, I think my parents would scratch their heads and say, why do you need somebody to help you give money? You know, because how hard can that be? But truthfully, it's a niche in the larger realm of nonprofit management, fund development, fundraising, and for people like me who've been employed in organized philanthropy and worked for foundations and been on the boards of foundations, you know, when I left work, I just decided I knew too much about how this operated to just retire. My head was exploding because I realized that most people who are seek funding from foundations don't understand how money is given, and that is that don't understand it. It's very hard to get it.
So. Wow. Okay. Well, look, we may need you for some other reasons.
Yes, I realize it, and I welcome those other reasons. And I try to be as nice as I can, but some people on this call will tell you that I'm a very hard-nosed consultant when I have to sit across the table from you and say, that's not going to fly. So, you know, I believe that, you know, what you shall know the truth. The truth will set you free, but not before it makes you miserable.
Oh, wow. Okay. I haven't heard that part before.
Yeah, there's a little part they forgot to tell you about, you know, telling the truth about yourself and your organization and your finances to other people is a skill. It requires a lot of thought and preparation, and that's what I do. And on the other hand, I help the people who give the money think about our community and who needs the help and why our organizations ought to be more prominent on their radar.
Wow. Okay.
So I do that as well.
That's
so
great.
Thank you. We have a small staff. I operate from home most of the time.
Look, don't we all? Everybody's at home now.
But even before, and so I'm really at a very good time in life, and I don't know. You know, I guess people think as you approach 80, you should be thinking about retiring. But I can't imagine. I can't even imagine what that would be.
Right. Yeah. Wow. Okay. All right. So you ready to jump into your presentation?
Well, I do need to ask you how it's going to be put up, because I'm talking on my laptop and I don't know if I can't see it.
I got it. You just tell me next slide, and
see, that's I forgot to tell you about all the things I can't do. There you go.
You see it? Okay.
Right. So I have been posting on Facebook for Black History Month. Someone challenged us to write about our own history as part of Black history. And I took that challenge. Mostly I have a lot of time on my hands now. And I thought, I will, you know, this is a great way to fill some hours. So I've been reflecting on my own experience, and I think my main objectives in doing this presentation for NCNW today are really to normalize, to make everybody feel more comfortable with telling their own life story. And not that you expect to do public presentations with it, but to leave a record of your life.
Yes.
So that generations, that Dr. Height used to say, generations not yet born won't have the struggles that we have had to learn the truth about who we are as a people. And it's amazingly informative every day. And I'll point these out in the slides. There isn't a day, a week that goes by when there isn't some kind of current event that relates to my own personal family history and life event. And therefore, it's easier to put yourself in the contemporary telling of these times if you are able to make the connections and if you are able to see the value. And so even with some of the things that we've talked about, advocacy and public affairs, community action, if you will, community engagement, the importance of you calling a legislator, and aren't we fortunate? I mean, I live in Windsor Hills. You know, all of my local elected officials are Black women. So heck yeah, I want to call them up and get to know them and have other people meet them and host events at our home. So because that is how things get done in America. And we are fortunate that we have access, that kind of access to our local elected officials. So in this journey, and I thank Arnetta for naming the roads we've traveled. So I'm asking you as I talk to think about the road you've traveled. And then we can maybe talk more later about those, there are intersections and we'll find them. We were in the same places at the same times.
Wow.
Doing the same things. There is no group presentation that I do where that isn't recognized. And so with NCNW being such a big part of my life, I know that you all precede me, even many of you, in claiming the history of this organization. It's very important. So my father was born on the beautiful island of Barbados. And who wouldn't want to be born in Barbados? You know, I wish I could go there now. And he was born late in the 19th century. He was born in 1893. And it's a stretch of my imagination to think about his life and growing up. But he did leave markers for me. So one of the stories he told me was how it felt to be living on Barbados the first time an airplane flew over. They thought it was the end of the world because there was no way for them to know that aerospace was an industry and that airplanes would be flying around the globe. And so it was an amazing phenomenon. So I look at life in that sense, that every day there are phenomena. But he left Barbados as a young man in his late teens and went to Panama to work on the Panama Canal. And that was a huge opportunity for many Black people from the Caribbean, the children of former slaves, to leave what was essentially agricultural, the agricultural part of their lives. In Barbados, my grandmother cut cane for a living. And so for her children, she wanted something different, and the opportunity for her son to learn a trade, to be a carpenter, to go and work on a project I don't even know what they thought the Panama Canal was. I don't know how they knew where Panama was, but the word got out that they could get jobs over there. And so he left. And that that's significant. And the significance for us in LA is we hear all the time about young people in parts of Los Angeles who've never been to the beach. We've heard those stories. And so when we talk about mentoring and being engaged with young people, part of that is opening up a world to them that they might not have known. So I'm grateful for whoever did that. My dad went and worked on the Panama Canal, and mostly the canal was built by the time he got there. And so he mostly worked on the housing on the Pacific end. And then he left and he went to Cuba and he worked on construction there, and he fell in love. I'm going to assume he fell in love with a lady or two there, but he did fall in love with the Spanish language. And he insisted that I learn Spanish, and that as a young child, he would quote Spanish colloquialisms. And so I have a love of Latin culture, Latin food, and I recognize that part of my history. When he left Cuba and came to the United States, he was still a citizen of Great Britain. Barbados was a British colony. And he was drafted into World War I. And so he had to go to Canada to board a ship in Halifax, Nova Scotia, to go to fight a war in where was it? England? Europe, France. I think that's where they were landing. And the ship got fogged in Nova Scotia. And so the war ended and he got off the ship. So he was never in the army and never in the war. They just let him all go. And so he was
born the same day.
Huh? Oh, I guess that's a mute
I'm
thing.
sorry. I mean, mute my.
Okay, so he came to New York, and he had a vision, still from the Panama Canal, a big vision, and you can change the slide, of doing big construction. The idea of building large buildings and bridges fascinated him, and he pursued that vision. Which again is remarkable for someone who came from a small island where there were no bridges and there were no high rises and there were no canals, that he could conceptualize and commit his life to doing large scale construction projects. And so he ended up in Harlem in New York in the late 20s, and he ran on a line of men on a street corner. They were lined up, and he inquired what was this line about, and he was told that they were going to meet Mr. Marcus Garvey, who was hiring people to go to Liberia. And so my father's been known to bend a rule and do an end run. He's not he wasn't a conventional person. So he went to the person at the front of the line and paid them some money. And that person got out of the line and gave my father, went in next. And when he came out, he was the superintendent of construction for the Black Star Line. And he was bound for Liberia under the UNIA flag to repatriate African Americans to the only African nation that was governed by Black people at that time, and that was Liberia.
Wow.
So there's a whole thread about nation building and this idea of what it means to be free, and how Black people perceive themselves. When if you go to a place like even in the Caribbean now, the islands where, the money, there are Black people in government. Everybody in government is Black. The money has Black people on it, the flags, that's very different than what existed in this country at the end of the 19th century. And so he got stuck in Liberia because Marcus Garvey, there was some fraud. There was a lot of intrusion by the FBI. And even though Garvey had the largest movement of Black people that had ever been seen in this country, it was continually under the scrutiny of law enforcement. And there was even a story, one of the Garvey papers are at UCLA. And so there are 6 volumes of books about Garvey at UCLA. And one of them, because I like fundraising, it talks about Garvey coming to Los Angeles in like 1919 and raising $40,000 in one day. Now you think about what $40,000 was in 1919 and think about raising it in one day and think about how long it would take us to raise $40,000 in Los Angeles today without the internet, without email, without cell phones. And you know, the magnitude of that, that effort just must be, it's very impressive to me. So he got stuck in Liberia. The Black Star Line went bankrupt. I assume, worked for the Liberian government. I think somebody needs to go on mute. I don't know who that is. And
yes, hello. If you just called in, area code 301, if you could please mute your device. Area code 301, please mute your device. Thank you.
Thank you. So so that part of my family's history is the precursor to my community engagement and investment and opportunity to be a part of the civil rights movements and subsequent efforts at social justice. For my father, he went on to build bridges, the George Washington Bridge, the Triborough Bridge, and then he got into real estate. My father was 50 when I was born, so he was, by 1943, when I was born, he was kind of ready to settle down. He'd had enormous adventures. He met my mother in the late 30s, and if you could change the slide. He was, I want to just refer to the cultural pride that he possessed, the kind of zeal that immigrants who come to this country bring, and they're seeking, and this sense of community building. Those were all parts of his vision. Go to the next slide, please. And so it's really uncanny how this man from Barbados came to connect to the family. This is my second great grandmother. Her name is Luzania Weaver. I found Luzania, the picture that I have of her, in a book called The Hereford County, North Carolina, The Free People of Color and their Descendants. And there's a young scholar at the University of North Carolina who is a historian, and he has devoted his scholarship to learning more about the people of North Carolina. And the reason that that's important, because those are his descendants too, but also because in 1948, this very famous book was published by E. Franklin Frazier, and it's called The Negro Family in the United States. And this was the first time that someone actually had used quantifiable data analysis from census information and other recorded history. And historians will tell you that they only publish what they discern from two provable facts. So this is a complete work of nonfiction. E. Franklin Frazier was a professor for a very long time at Howard University. And he had a chapter in his book on the free mixed race people of North Carolina, because North Carolina has the most pristine, vital, what do they call them? Vital records, birth certificates, death certificates. And you can, I went there and went to the courthouse, and I could hold my grandparents' wedding license, and just remarkable information that is maintained as part of the vital records of the state of North Carolina. So Warren Miltier, did his doctoral dissertation, sort of following up where Dr. E. Franklin Frazier left off. And now he has a couple of books out about the Black people of North Carolina, which in a way is the story of Black people in America, and how our lives are very intertwined with Native Americans and Europeans, and how we survived, thrived, built businesses, learned considerable self-sufficiency, and all before the Civil War. We were able to build communities, thriving businesses, and make a way in this country. The next slide. So that's all about these themes, because both my second great grandmother, Luzania, and my father represented these values of self-reliance, community, strong women. Growing up as the only girl, my siblings are all boys. My father would say, there isn't anything you can't do. And he would pretty much leave the child rearing and discipline to my mother, except when it came to gender inequality, in which case he would usually intervene. And his message was, if the boys can do it, she can do it. And so I grew up with a sense of empowerment that still rivals relationships in our family to this day. So it's not common in the rest of the society. Go to the next one. And so I know that, like me, you all have these traits that you can trace in your families. You just listed a whole bunch of organizations that you all are part of. My dad founded a credit union, wow. History of home ownership, the aspects of self-sufficiency that if we follow what's happening in Texas now, and the crisis that emerge, well, the crisis is always worse when your government fails you. And most immigrants and many people from the South and throughout our history have known that you can't be completely reliant on someone else to protect and support you. And so you see people melting snow and doing things to survive. And that sense of self-reliance, while it's tragic in the face of government failure, it also builds resilience in families when they do survive. And so the last one, monuments, the monument to Mary McLeod Bethune was a big part of my life. Move. Am I running out of time, Arnetta?
No, take your time. And let me say this. If anyone needs to leave, you all are free to, but I'm going to stay and I want you to just finish your presentation. I'm fine.
Thank you.
Yes.
Okay. Let's go to the next slide then and see who we have. That's my mother. So that's Luzania's great granddaughter. And my mother was born in Winton, North Carolina in Hereford County. And my mother is blessed to be both beautiful and easily mistaken for a white woman.
Wow.
You know, so the issues of colorism were alive and well in our family. My mother never, ever described herself as anything but colored or Negro or Black. But I have been in line in a store with my mother, and she would stand behind me, and clerks in the store would reach around me and say, "Can I help you, ma'am?" And she would have to say, "You can help my daughter." She tried very hard not to be confrontational, but having grown up in North Carolina, she understood racism, segregation, terror in a way that my father didn't. My father was just this brash, you know, audacious, swashbuckling. People called him a scallywag. You know, he was just like, you get out of my way kind of guy. But my mom was just the opposite. Maybe that was the secret to their marriage. But she was remarkably skilled. I'm sure she made the dress she has on, and she made every single one of mine. And, you know, every curtain and every, you know, when something wore out, she just made it into something else. Wow. So she sewed, she cooked, she was a great housekeeper because she had to learn that, because she and her sisters were housekeepers in the homes of wealthy people. Her mother died in childbirth. And this is a touch point. My mother was 18. She had to drop out of school. If you go to the next slide, she had to drop out of high school and raise her siblings. So there is her mother in the top left. Ollie Weaver Butler was married to Spurgeon Butler in the right, bottom right. And these are all people of color. These are Black people, Negroes, colored people. But you can understand the confusion that some had. And in our family, particularly the young man in the bottom middle has chosen to not be Black and colored and Negro. And so he lives his life as a white man. I mean, he has absolutely no contact with our family. And that is a kind of rift and result of just not race and class and color, and the impact that it has, because it was my mother who raised him when his mother died. And it was my father who's, I don't know if we had a picture of him, who's a very brown-skinned man. Nobody would ever confuse him for being white, who put him through college. So there's these tensions survive for generations in families. And I'm not sure that we have an appropriate amount of therapies that help families deal with the implications of color and colorism and race. Move on, we'll get to, so here's Harlem. My mother left North Carolina, and okay, the Smith family needs to mute. They're good. Okay, so here's Harlem. My mother leaves Virginia. She was living in Newport News, Virginia with her father and siblings when her mother died. And if you've read The Warmth of Other Suns and the Great Migration of People Who Left the South, my mother left and came to New York. And she too was living in Harlem, not far from where my father was living, but that is not where they met. But you know that Harlem was the great Mecca in the Northeast, Chicago in the Midwest, Detroit. You know, there were people they weren't sure what was there, but they was gonna go there because it was better than where they were. And so they got there and they found jobs and livelihoods. And so many of us have this sense that we're from somewhere, but we're really from somewhere else.
Mm.
And those customs, particularly food, have survived. So let's move on. And, oh, okay. So we are now into NCNW. So I'm going to go back just a little bit. Don't change the slide. So my mother and father met in Brooklyn. And my father, by that time, had made what people would call a colored man's fortune. That's not a real fortune. That's just a fortune that colored people could have. And so he owned some real estate. My mother had an apartment in one of his buildings, and it was the Depression. She couldn't afford to pay the rent. And, you know, somehow he said, that's no problem. She did his laundry and cooked his food. And, you know, to hear him tell it, he said, well, if you're doing all that, we might as well get married, you know, and they kind of, you know, it worked out for us. It wasn't the most romantic stories, but it's a good story because her life changed from one of poverty to middle class practically overnight. But she held on to those ideas of self-sufficiency, and so we're for our family, even though we had a middle-class lifestyle, we all had to learn to clean houses, scrub floors, wipe down the stairs, mow the lawn. It was just like, you know, they'd have somebody come and mow the lawn one day and have one of us mow it the next day just to make sure we knew how to mow a lawn. So it was, you know, it was not as if we were the children of privilege, even though I recognize that having my own bedroom and a home and a mother at home every day and a father who was self-employed and a Republican. That was a little different. And so when I was going to college, I got a scholarship from the National Council of Negro Women from the View Park, from the Suffolk County section. My parents had moved out to Long Island. There was a wonderful woman named Beulah Allman and her husband, and she was maybe the section president. And she just took an interest in me, and you know, she told me all about the council, and she wanted me to have a scholarship, and she wanted me to be in a cotillion. So tomboy Fran had little interest in cotillions. And since I had graduated in June and I was 18 and I was going off to Howard University, it would mean that I would have to come home to New York on weekends to rehearse for the cotillion. So I was able to get out of the cotillion. But I've always been grateful to NCNW for the scholarship. So I knew about this person called Dorothy Height and I had no reason to believe I would ever be in her company, not to mention in her employment, you know? So through some set of circumstances, my own community activism in New York, I went to work for the National Council of Negro Women to help in the run-up to the unveiling of the Bethune Memorial. And that's when I met Dr. Height again. I had done some workshops with various people, and you know, our circles began to close in. And so I had both a personal and a professional relationship with Miss Height. I called her. Everybody called her Miss Height. And she always called me that time, my name was Dory. She called me Miss Dory. And sometimes if she was really feeling very close and affectionate, she would call me Fran Dory. But it was always a first and a last name. There was never on any day, no matter how grown I thought I was, that I would refer to her as Dorothy. that was not happening. And so after a while, I guess somewhere around my 50th birthday, I guess she decided we should start calling each other, more familiar. She felt like a friend. She had been a mentor. I studied her. I'd be in meetings and I'd look at her behavior, her mannerisms. She could sit in a meeting, she would crochet an entire blanket in a meeting. The meetings were long and invariably boring. And she, think about the national board at that time with 40 or 50 members. And someone on your call just spoke about all the affiliates, the presidents of the affiliate organizations were there. And the great thing about her is that it was her humility. She would let other people talk. She would have meetings, and she had no ego in sense of running it. And so people could really talk, pose ideas, debate topics. And she would sit there and knit and listen and read. And then at the end, she'd kind of clear her throat and say how she thought the organization ought to move. And then invariably someone made a motion and they accepted her idea. And that's how the organization sort of moved. So it felt like power in terms of my understanding. It just felt like soft love power. And of course, I have trouble convincing young people now that I was fully 40 years old before I was allowed to speak at a meeting. Everybody's got this, everybody claiming their voice now, and everybody's got to have a say. For some of us, that's a little hard to accept, considering how long we sat, took notes, listened, observed, and then eventually earned the privilege to say something in a meeting. So the National Council of Negro Women for me was an introduction to leadership on a level that I hadn't really understood it. I was popular in high school. I was a class president. I had leadership roles in my community, but I never thought that I would be in a position to move public policy. And to see public policy unfold and understand the power of women to shape public policy happened because Dr. Height saw something in me that I didn't necessarily see in myself. So the monument to Mary McLeod Bethune, it could look like a program activity for an organization. People raise money. It took 14 acts of Congress. There were clearly people who did not want the first statue to a woman or an African American on public land. And so the council had to raise the money. And every 2 years, each Congress had to reauthorize the act. And $400,000 in the 60s and early 70s would be the equivalent of maybe $15-16 million now. And so all those fundraising ideas you had, like have a little fish fry and have it, that's exactly what those sisters were doing, was having those events and sending that money to the National Council. And in the office where I worked, it was Dr. Height would just say, well, we have to send out, if we want 35,000 people to come to Washington, we're going to have to send out 250,000 invitations. Now, we didn't have a postal meter. We had Mimeo machines. And then Dr. Height would say, and I want all the invitations hand addressed. What? who is going to address 250,000 invitations? And the way she raised her eyebrows and looked, you knew the answer was you. So for so many years, I think at least one of my kids is on this phone. Every night of the week, I would go home, get the kids after school, and we go back to NCNW office and address envelopes and stamp them in the post office with over. And over a period of weeks and months, we actually got all those invitations out. So it was a tremendous learning experience. The statue in the park with Mrs. Bethune, all statues in Washington were designed to face the Capitol. So if Mrs. Bethune's statue was going to face the Capitol, it would have to, because it was behind a lesser statue of Abraham Lincoln, it was, as people put it delicately, Mrs. Bethune would be looking at his butt. So Dr. Height said, we're going to have to convince the Department of Interior and the National Park Service to change that. And it dawned on me, that's a significant piece of public policy. The way the statues face, the reason for that, the Capitol. And so to change a statue that had been put there of Abraham Lincoln by white people to have a Black woman be able to have that on the show, that was a major piece of public policy. And we had to agree that we would never say that we were going to turn Mr. Lincoln around. What we had to say was that the statue of Mr. Lincoln would be repositioned. And just that little change in words, that was the essence of Dorothy Height. She was diplomatic to her core. She was diplomatic to her core. She knew that if we went and said we were going to turn it around, that sounded more like a civil rights march than something that people would actually agree to. So in this picture on the Bethune Memorial, the unveiling, well, you see our beloved Cicely Tyson, who just left us, was on the platform and read the last will and testament of Mary McLeod Bethune. And there you see Coretta Scott King coming up on the platform. And that group of people sitting there, you see Shirley Chisholm, and I think the person to her left was the owner of Winn-Dixie stores, Mrs. King, the sculptor. The dignitaries were out in force. And the statue on the lower right is Dr. Height presenting a certificate of completion to then Gerald Ford, who had become the vice president, because all of that drama took place in a political environment that's much like the one we are now. This was July 10th, 1974, and Richard Nixon had not yet resigned the presidency. So the big question of the day was, is Nixon coming? And so one of the jobs that Dr. Height gave me was to coordinate the security, which meant, and again, I get emotional thinking about the current events, that I was in the office of the Capitol Police and the National Park Police and the DC Police. And thank goodness for the Black police officers, the Guardians in New York City. The Guardians taught me how to talk police talk and talk to the police and, win over the police so that, in fact, we got effective security. And it's the insurrection that took place on January 6th was like a personal affront to me, because those people do their jobs and they coordinate. I learned during that unveiling, the statue is 13 blocks from the Capitol. Well, the moment you step off that parkland where the while you're on that piece of land where the statue is, that's the National Park Police. Once you get in the street, it's the DC Police. Once you go down 12 blocks and enter the Capitol grounds, it's the National Capitol Police. And there you're dealing with the Secret Service and the FBI and all of the other security forces. So if I knew that in 1974,
Wow.
and watch what happened in 2021, they knew that too. They could not have done that they could not have had that insurrection without the support of people inside those police forces. It couldn't happen. And it just galls me to think that that's what's become of certain parts of law enforcement in this nation. So keep moving before I get too mad. Okay, next one. Oh, so that's Carl Albert. That's he was the Speaker of the House. He has the position that Nancy Pelosi had, and because it was the Congress that had to pass it, Dr. Height is also presenting him with a certificate. And here you see I had a little bit of a hiccup because opposite that, but we're still talking about leadership. In that picture on the top left, that's my dad at whatever age, he might have been 21, 22, and the 7 commissioners who actually went to Liberia for Marcus Garvey on that ship. So my dad is the one that's kind of off to his left, to my left, you're right. And as a young man, I mean, it's sometimes, I remind my grandchildren who sometimes resist going across town to the grocery store. Your grandfather went to Liberia. Your great grandfather went to Liberia, on a ship that fell apart and couldn't make it back. So this sense of, again, of having adventure in your life and wanting to live for something larger than yourself, it was very powerful. So moving right ahead, I'm way over now. Let's see, what's next? That's the end. So that is, that's the whole goal of this, is to say that everybody has a Black history. And it's just been amazingly insightful for me to learn more and more about my history, to find actual history books with my family's history in the history books, and then to have met people like Shirley Chisholm, Dr. Height. I just can't tell you. I mean, I have this like little mental committee, and it's they're my mentors, and whenever something happens, I just like, oh my gosh, what would Dr. Height do now? I just have that sense of slow down and think this through, and maybe your first thought is not your best thought, and maybe you ought to call on some of the people whose thinking you respect. And so I have a lot of people around me who are alive and well, and I can talk to them too, but I keep the mental committee in place so that at least I hope the decisions that I make to guide my family, to participate in my community, to, maintain a business that is ethical and operates on integrity, that those are things that I learned. I'm going to tell you one fundraising story, and it was just a few weeks before the Bethune Memorial, and the sculptor said if he didn't have a payment of $14,000, that the memorial wasn't going to be built. The monument wasn't going to be finished. So we were all sitting around in Dr. Height's office like, where are we going to get this extra $14,000 from? And she is like, I want you to call every section president. I want you to call every affiliate president. I want you to call. And like, these were, okay, you want me to call Tess Hoover, the president of United Methodist Women, and ask her for some more money? They gave us $100,000. You know, she was like, well, see, they might make it 101, you know. I was like, she would not take any no for an answer. So we did the best we could. Everybody was on the phone calling, and we still couldn't get enough pledges to cover the cost of finishing the monument. So Dr. I used to carry like a big kind of a, you know, like the conference bags we get every time we go somewhere. And she would, any of us would pick up the phone and dial a number for her. And she'd tell us who we were calling and everything. But you know, when she went down in her bag and came up with her little black book, that this was something the rest of us didn't know anything about. So she was sitting there and she went through the book and she got the number and she dialed it herself. We were like, well, who is this? This literally, we couldn't figure out who it was. But she didn't tell us to leave the room. So we sat there and she said, this is Dorothy Height. May I speak to Henry? The hell is Henry? No, it's like your cousin, you know, Henry? Who is that? You know? And she gets Henry on the phone and she explains to Henry that we've done everything. And she enumerated everything. We've contacted these many section presidents, these many affiliate presidents. We've talked to all of our partner organizations. We've done all this and we still don't have the money. And so I really need to ask you to help us. And Henry says, okay, you know, I'll wire the money in the morning, you know. And so she's fine. We hang up and we're all like hanging in the air. Who is Henry? And she said, Henry Ford. And so we said, Dr. Height, you have Henry Ford's number in your little phone book and you made us call all these people. And she said, yes, because actually I needed to be truthful when I told Mr. Ford that we had done everything we could.
Wow.
So fundraising lesson. I could go on and on and on, you know. You'll have me come back and tell more stories. It's great. Thank you all so much.
Oh, wow. Oh my gosh.
Who is
That
Thank you,
was
Fran.
awesome, man. Oh, why don't we have another hour to now unpack some more of that?
Well, you know, she made history for a reason. And I'll tell you, the National Council of Negro Women and Dorothy Height in particular takes a lot of flack for not being feminists, Black feminists, radicals.
Wow.
But you show me the feminist organization. Dr. Height was one of the big six. Think of who the big six were, civil rights leaders that were up on that platform in the March on Washington in 1963.
Right.
Yep. She didn't have a speaking role. And you know, when you talk to the, you know, A. Philip Randolph, Martin Luther King, you know, Whitney Young, you know, all these organizations, none of them had a base as big and as powerful as the National Council of Negro Women.
Right.
You count up all of those sections and all of those affiliates, none of those national organizations compare in just the size and the strength of their membership. And I used to think it was just chauvinism. It was just why they didn't let her speak. And now I understand it was jealousy.
It was, absolutely. A lot of those organizations didn't even reach the West Coast.
He could have taken over. And that, I mean, that really gets my bristle up. And you know, people used to challenge her, well, why don't you change the name from the National Council of Negro Women to the National Council of Black Women?
Yeah.
Or make it something relevant. And she said, it is relevant.
Right.
This organization was founded, it was radical to be called Negro.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
That piece of history is just amazing. I love it. Thank you all.
Yeah, you know what? Thank you. Thank you. Let's just think, maybe there's just a couple of questions.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm
Let's
here.
just maybe take a couple of questions. Does anybody have anything they want to ask or quick commentary?
Comments, add something. I know some of y'all were there. Come on. I know you were there.
You said your father, did he do all this traveling by himself? Like he went from Barbados to Panama, which is one of my favorite places. I always wanted to retire there. And then he went from Panama to, did he do this alone or did he take relatives with him?
Well, well, that's part of the mystery of who he was, you know. There is a citation in the 1940 census in New York that says that Rupert Jemmott was married to someone named Gladys Jemmott. So, you know, I'm just a very inquisitive, curious child, always have been, you know. So I say to my aunt, my mother and father were dead. I said to my aunt, was my father married before? And she said, no. Why would you say that? I said, because the census says that this Gladys Jemmott who claims that she, and my aunt got incensed. Now, she's the youngest daughter in that family that was saved by my father, you know, and so they're very loyal to him. And she just went off on me something terrible. I said, well, gee, I've discovered something here that needs to be investigated, because otherwise she would have just said no, you know. But because she went off, I said, there. So, you know, a lot of times people live together, room together. There were informal relationships. But to your point, there is a museum in Panama. The next time you go, maybe we'll go together. Yeah. There's a museum of the Afro-Antillean Museum of the documents, the history of the people who came from the Lower Antilles, which is Barbados is one of those islands. And the docent there told me that many of the women from those islands followed the men to Barbados, and they came. And I assume they lived together. There's a whole page in the telephone directory in Panama City of Jemmotts. That's not a Spanish name. Okay, so, you know, I haven't solved the answer to that question, but there are assumptions. I'm pretty sure he didn't go with anyone to Liberia, because the 7 men and the travel and everything and the stories that are pretty well documented in the Garvey papers, that those men were traveling alone. But I also, with all due respect to brothers on the phone, very few men wait until their late 40s to partner with somebody. And it could have been previous relationships. It probably was nothing he'd want to talk about in front of my mother or around my mother's family, but it wouldn't surprise me. It wouldn't surprise me. And I ran up on an anthropologist in Panama who said she believed that someone who had just died was a sibling, would have been a half sibling. He would have been in his 90s. And so when I was there, so they didn't call my dad a scallywag or nothing, you know. He was a wonderful man. I love him dearly, but I also believe in my heart that he probably had other relationships. But as long as I can't find a marriage license or anything to validate that, it's only a speculation.
Thank you, Fran, for the journey.
Yes, it's been great. So you definitely have to come back and do part 2. Definitely. Thank you so much. So we don't really have time to hear from all the guests, but I want to thank everyone who has joined us today, the members, and I see faces from the community, and I see some of Fran's family and friends. So thank you so much. Could
I just, you know, we shouldn't close.
Okay.
We shouldn't close without encouraging everybody to support the Viewport Park section of NCNW and the wonderful work. of the organizations. It's a lovely way to spend an afternoon.
Yes.
But these sisters are working. If you want to know, if you want information on a daily basis about the number of COVID cases in the Black community in Los Angeles, they're collecting and maintaining that data and advocating for appropriate policy and practice responses to make sure that vaccines are available. And this is serious work for this organization. And I hope you will consider a small donation, and a membership would even be better. Y'all are members of the triple A. What is it?
Okay,
The
yeah.
members of AAA and AARP and all that. Just add another membership. Yeah, anybody invited you to have to come to the and do all that. But build the membership and support the organizations that you.
Thank you, Fran. I appreciate that. And you reminded me to put the slide up, and Jasmine put our information in the chat as well. You guys can just click on some of those links there. And if you don't want to be a member, that's fine. Share the info, but we welcome your donation as well. You can just donate. We have a great program that's ongoing right now. We're teaching young women ages 18 to 25 about good health and HIV/AIDS and good sexual practices, sex education. It's a very deep series that we're executing now. So we'd love your support on that. And we've got some great initiatives coming up. So the information is here. I so appreciate everyone. If there's nothing else, I'm going to ask our chaplain, Ms. Gail Biggers, to close us out with a prayer. And then we will be on our way. And if anybody wants to hang out after the prayer, I'll stay on so you can get the information. And if Fran's still on, you can chat with her. Gail, can you give us a prayer, please?
Absolutely. This has been fantastic. Fantastic. Thank you, Miss Fran. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for this beautiful conversation. Thank you so much for reminding us that we all carry a deep and meaningful legacy. Thank you so much for all the sisters and brothers who've gathered here today, from our president to the board, to all of the members of the NCNW through Park, the family, Miss Fran, the new friends, the extended friends. God, we're just so grateful for this conversation. Thank you, Lord, that we are taking from this conversation a desire to have adventure, a desire to live beyond ourselves. We want to be skilled, like Miss Fran's mom. We want to use our hands to do great things for you and for our community. We want to be resourceful. We want to tell our stories. We want to just have a rich legacy, and we want to just continue to perpetuate love. God, thank you so much for just being with us. Bless every home that is represented here this afternoon. Oh God, keep these words stirring in our hearts and our minds, and help us to keep moving forward for our people, for our community, God, for our families, for our homes, Lord, and thinking about the future. And God, you get the glory through us. In your name, amen.
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 All right.
Thank you, everybody.
Hi, thank you. Thank you. This is great.
Thank you.
Great, great.
I'm going to read some of the chat.
Go ahead. Oh, you can save the chat too. I'm gonna grab this. Maybe I'll stop recording. Let me start recording so I can.